With us right here on Morning at NTV. Well, our Kickstarter conversation is going to be focusing on a report by Action Aid Uganda and also the Center for Domestic Violence Prevention, that is CEDOVIP, and MIPUMA. The report indicates that between March and June this year, there were more cases of domestic violence, especially when the lockdown was instituted. As it is, Action Aid Uganda decided to create safe places for young people, the victims of gender-based violence who are fleeing the perpetrators, so that they can have a safe space to be able to be getting some kind of redress for their problems. But then as it is, by September 1st, according to the report, these shelters would have gone out of funding or existence because of money issues. They're supposed to have given these shelters to the district local governments, but even the district local governments are saying, we do not have money to actually handle these shelters. So what will be the fate of these shelters and so forth? We are not going to be only talking about the sustainability of the shelters, but also gender-based violence and the social norms perpetuating gender-based violence against women. Yes, social norms, shared beliefs about others, issues to do with female genital mutilation, when the whole community says, for you to be a woman, you must be circumcised, you must undergo FGM. So all those social norms and so forth, the issue of the shelters are going to be discussed right here on Morning at NTV. And I'm now joined by Mawode Mugisha, the resource person at the Search program. Yes, that has recently run out of money. You're going to be explaining to us what that actually means for the program. And Xavier Ejoyi, the County Director, Action Aid Uganda. And let's start with you, Mr. Xavier. Let us in on the report. I mentioned between March and June, but you started your operations in January. You anticipated most of these problems in January. So let us understand what has been happening between January and June this year as far as GBV cases are concerned. Have they been skyrocketing or going down?
Thank you so much, Malcolm, for this opportunity. Romeo, rather, for this opportunity. I'm glad to be here at NTV Morning. First of all, I just want to correct that Action Aid's work on gender-based violence prevention and response dates decades in the early 2000s to date. It's something that Action Aid does in its vision. It's something that is not just projectized, it's actually at the core of its strategy and vision that we go. Funding comes and ends, but the work that we do continues. Along the way, we build partnerships with donors, with government departments, with other civil society organizations, with communities.
So Xavier, help us understand, why is GBV an issue and how does it affect young women, girls and so forth?
So I just wanted to draw back to that. Between July and December last year, we had about, in our gender-based violence shelters, or the safe physical spaces that we create for survivors of gender-based violence, we had a total of 1,905. But in that in the corresponding 6-month period, which matches with the COVID-19 lockdown period, that number shot significantly to 4,826 cases. Now, which means that the lockdown really increased the number of cases, and that has an effect on the livelihood of women and the survivors, especially on families, but also on the economy. It holds back development. When you have a significant section of your population really facing violence, that is traumatized, that is stigmatized, that is physically in pain, and that means that they cannot do the things that they ought to do to make their lives, first of all, their families, and by extension, this nation, a country that cares for the people. And so that is really what we're talking about here.
And what was the major cause of the rise in the cases?
The major cause of the rise of the cases, there are a number of things. There are, we saw cases of physical violence, meaning somebody is injured, is beaten, is battered in all the brutal forms that you can imagine. But also we had issues about maintenance, maybe there's an expectation of provision of food, of finances in the family. That is not happening. We had cases that related to marital relations, sexual violence in the house, which includes rape, it includes defilement, it includes other forms of sexual violence in the community. And then we had issues of land so prominently, you know, where largely the men are saying, okay, this land here, I want to put it on sale for whatever reasons they're going through, but the land belongs to the family. And so any questions about that resulted into other forms of violence, physical, psychological, and even the economic forms of violence where the family is deprived of their means of livelihood. So that's how some of the top really expression of forms of violence during the period that we're talking about. But yeah, it's a deeply entrenched in our society. Gender-based violence is large in Uganda today, and it continues growing. Unfortunately, during the lockdown period, that face of Uganda really manifested prominently. And yet one would have expected that when people are at their homes, they should be living in harmony. And we're seeing that where the lockdown happened and people are living home, we're seeing violence in those very homes, which really exposes the vulnerability of our social structure. It's not as we think it is, and something needs to be done about it. Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the issue of the social norms and how they perpetuate violence against girls and women.
Yeah, to talk a little bit more about social norms in our societies. You know, these are the do's and the don'ts, expectations from society. And you find that traditionally in most of our cultures, there are so many don'ts, you know, for women. You know, expectations of our societies about women. And this really, the roots of this is the issue of dominance and power from the male, you know, from the male members of society. Our society gives power to the males. And because these males are brought up knowing that they have power over the women, they tend to use that to suppress, you know, dominate, and you know, violate the rights of women and girls. And that's what you find, that even when you look at it in all sorts of forms, that this happens, especially we know that gender-based violence happens to everybody. But the majority of those who suffer are women and girls. And it is a power issue in our society. And that is what we call patriarchy, the way men are socialized to be, you know, to dominate women, and women to receive this as given, and to look at themselves as if they are not able, you know, to overcome this. So these social norms are perpetuated through our socialization process, through our cultures, and this is how our society is framed. And people many times don't realize that they are actually violating rights. But what this program has been working on is to address those social norms, to make people realize that actually by doing certain things, we are violating rights, we are impinging on other people's rights. And this has been, you know, sometimes we think that these things don't change, but there are opportunities for change. We have seen these social norms begin to change.
Help us break down some of those social norms. Especially the correlations between the social norms and female genital mutilation.
For instance, you know, female genital mutilation, where it is practiced. In this country, we have a few areas where it is practiced in the Sebei region and in Karamoja. And in Karamoja, it is also some parts like Amudat, Moroto, some parts don't have it. So, you know, it is a social norm that is actually imposed on women. It is an expectation that if a woman is not cut, then you don't have, you know, that woman does not have value. And it is so, it is so believed by both women and men. I'll just give an example to demonstrate, you know, a testimony from a woman. A woman of my age that I met in Sebei region. And she said that her age, she really wanted to go to school when she was young. And then when she was 15, she was being chased to be circumcised so that she can go get married. She went to her aunt. Her aunt said, no, you must be circumcised. She went to her uncle for protection. The uncle said, no, you must be circumcised. She went everywhere because she wanted to continue school. until it was almost impossible for her to get any support to enable her go to school rather than be circumcised and prepared for marriage. So eventually, she got married before she was circumcised. She found a man who accepted to marry her. But when she was married, her mother-in-law even went in the village wailing, saying, you know, that some calamity has fallen me. They have brought this woman who is not circumcised. So when she just was hitting against the wall everywhere, even in her marriage, she said, this time I missed school, I'm not going to miss my marriage. So she just took herself to the surgeon and said, you just cut me.
So that she could fit in.
So that she could fit in society, because she couldn't go to the well to fetch water when others are there. She couldn't go to meetings. She was ostracized. So she didn't belong. And these are the norms that make people like, you know, feel that they have to belong. When you go to places like Amudat, like, you know, Tapach, where we have been working, where Sedovip has been working, and Queen, young women even have songs that try to discriminate those who are not cut. And they put value on those who are cut. You say, look at us, we are cut, we are very important people of society, but for you, you can't draw water here. You are less than, you know, than a woman. You can't.
Even according to the investigations that were done by NTV Uganda, we discovered that even the men that were against female genital mutilation preferred women who were cut. I didn't understand the whole back and forth. How do you say, I do not support FGM, yet in your house you have a woman who was cut? All these inconsistencies within members of the public.
Yes,
how are you addressing all these challenges?
Yes, Romeo, the first thing is that, as Maud said, gender-based violence in various forms, including FGM and rape and defilement and physical assault, they take place where the minds of men especially,
yes,
and generally society has been prepared, and that's what we're calling social norms, to create an expectation that violence is okay. And you've heard people joke around it, they undermine the survivors' narratives around it. They're saying, you know what, in society it is fine. Actually, beating is a sign of love. You've heard that saying, people yes. say. That is creating an expectation in the minds of society, that this is something that we have dealt with here, and it is understandable, it should be expected, and that is what we need to start with. That's what this program sought to do.
So the problem is with these reference groups.
It's the reference group that builds a wall around a culture and perpetuates it, and saying this negative culture or social norm yes. is important. There's a reward for adhering to it, and there's a sanction for not adhering to it. And so in programming, and of course this has taken place over decades, maybe centuries. Now in programming you have to seek to undo that damage that has been done to the mindset of society, to say that this pattern is okay. It happened during my grandparents' time, my parents' time, and so even now it should be acceptable. And so we really try to unpack that and ensure that the society is relieved of that expectation and the burden, especially on women. That presses that oppression of women, even physical battering, is trivialized and shown as a sign of love or something like that. And that is what this program sought to do. You start from there. And of course, because it has been in place for decades, maybe centuries, it means that it's not going to be an easy ride to unpack that, to peel that back, and to ensure that the society itself recognizes that this form of violence, this form of brutality against a section of society needs to end. And we recognize that it's not going to be today is the 1st of September, you wake up on the 2nd of September, it is done. No, it requires some diligent work and approaching people and understanding what actually informs this, and begin to engage with them and begin to make them realize that this is not what our society ought to be. For us to progress, for us to ensure that girls in school, that they're getting employment, yes. that they're having a livelihood, that they're contributing towards the household, that is something that needs to be going deeper into.
And indeed, in light of this whole COVID-19 pandemic, it has caused disruptions which wouldn't warrant you to have that physical interaction. that you're looking for, to go to a community and assess where the root cause of the problem is coming from. So many people have resorted to online technology to do their work. So help us understand, as Action Aid Uganda, how has COVID-19 affected your operations?
Yeah, COVID-19 really was a major disruption to the work that we're doing, because to do some of these things that we're talking about, you need a physical interaction with different members of society. You need to understand the club or the reference group of men who are perpetuating that. And you need to meet with what in the communities they call the surgeons, but they're really the women who are doing the cutting. You need to interact with them. And you need to understand through different champions. You need to closely interact with survivors and so on. When this happened, we did not abandon survivors. In our shelters, in our physical shelters that we're able to do, we were able to ensure that we're able to reach the different segments of society, but we also we adapted very fast, because we work through phone lines. We were able to publish phone lines where survivors or people who are facing the risk of violence were able to come and call into the shelter, and we counsel them on phone. We refer them to the courts of law or to police, to hospitals for medical attention, and so on. So yes, it was a disruption, but no, it did not stop the work that we're doing.
Can I add on that?
Yeah, you can also add on that, and you can also help us understand how the SURGE program is also helping young women and girls alleviate cases of GBV, before we go for a short break.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to add on how we have been working during the COVID era. What has happened over the program is that we work with the community, what we call community structures. We have trained local people who include what we call community activists. We have so many, more than 400 in the areas where we have worked. We have worked with the religious leaders and cultural leaders, and we have trained them. So during this time of COVID, those people were in the communities, and we were in touch with them, through the phone and so on, to make sure that they go into the communities. During the lockdown, like in the rural areas, life was going on. People were able to walk and go to places. So these community activists were supporting families and individuals and helping them to being able to counsel them. In some places, like in Kumi and Palisa, we established what we call, sub-county GBV desks, which were nearer to the people. So it was easier for them to be able to, for the women, for example, who had problems, to be able to report. And another thing we used is that each location bought a number of megaphones. So these community activists would go to the communities with megaphones, talking to, walking and talking to people to prevent gender-based violence.
Right,
so that support was provided.
Okay, please hold that thought. We are going to take a very short break, and I shall return with that conversation on how the SURGE program
watching Morning at NTV.
Welcome back, and many thanks for staying with us right here in Morning at NTV. We are talking about gender-based violence that got so rife after the institution of a lockdown in March. Up to date, so many women and girls have been victims of gender-based violence because of the lockdown and other measures that were instituted to curb the spread and the contraction of the virus. That is something we haven't quite explored with my two guests right here in studio. How did the lockdown itself exacerbate the violence against women? Let me bring it to you, Ms. Mugisha. Let's talk about that. The lockdown itself that was instituted by government, how did it make things very, very impossible for women, and how did the SURGE program that you put in place help to alleviate the same problems that were caused?
Okay, let me just start maybe where we were before the lockdown. That Uganda has a very high rate of gender-based violence. We are at 56%. That is through the UBO statistics of 2016. That every woman between the age of 15 to 49 has experienced gender-based violence in her life. So that's where we are. Compared in the region, we are actually the highest when you compare with Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda. If I talk about the East African region, Uganda has the highest, rate of gender-based violence. So when COVID came in, people were locked together, locked in urban areas. They were locked together in places that were not very familiar to some of them, family members, because they would go, in the urban areas, people get up early, they go to work, they come late. They were not used to being together and without any movement, and then with limited resources, as my colleague had already said.
Yes.
Then this escalated the violence. They know the children need food, there are no resources. So this also escalated the violence. But we must know that this violence was already there, it just increased. Then in the rural areas, you will find that women didn't have access to where to go to report. They would not access the shelter where they would get counseling. They would not easily access the police and so on. So this violence remained hidden in the household. Then we have the issue of girls, and especially girls from school. They are at home. And what we saw, happening was that there was a lot of incest, because these children were being left with relatives who are maybe not so close, and then they would have these sexual relationships. And then we have also recorded high numbers of girls who, like in Busoga region, who got pregnant during this this period, which means they are not going back to school unless something happens to some of them, being able to deliver and maybe have another chance by their parents. But most of these girls are not going back to school. So this is how COVID-19 has really made a bad situation worse.
All right, Xavier, what are some of the emerging challenges towards these shelters, the GBV, gender-based violence shelters? What are some of the emerging challenges that are affecting Action Aid Uganda and its ability to handle the sustainability of these GBV shelters?
So, as I said, the first thing is that the COVID-19 period, that lockdown, that escalated the violence at homes and in different spaces against women and girls is actually a big challenge. As long as we have the current state of issues that we have, I earlier on stated that if you take the 6 months from July to December 2019, if you compare that with the 6 months after that period, which is from January to June, the number of cases more than doubled. We're talking about in the period before, we had 1,905 cases recorded in the 13 shelters that were running under this program. That number rose to 4,826.
The people who ran to the shelters then alerted the authorities at the shelters.
The people who reported to the shelter seeking for help, whether it is medical, whether it is legal aid, whether it is psychosocial support or counseling, the shelters provide safe spaces for people to report. And those, some of them are accommodated for a few days, a minority of them. But this is the number of people who were seeking for help and they reported to the shelters.
So let's talk about the emerging issues from those shelters.
Yeah.
We also hear that you're running out of funding for these shelters. Help us understand and demystify.
So it is the project that was running. A project, by its definition, comes to an end.
Today?
Yes, the project ended yesterday. So this project comes to an end. And so it's not that we're running out of funding like the funding disappeared. Yeah. No, this is from the onset. As an organization, Action Aid runs with funding.
So the shelters will continue running?
The shelters are continuing running, but right now we are actually working with modalities of within Action Aid, within district local government, within government at the central level, at Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development. How do we carry on this work? And even looking for additional funds to ensure that we expand this work across the country, because we're only in 13 districts. 13 districts is a drop. If violence is happening, there are 135 districts. It means that something needs to be done at each and every part of this country to prevent and respond to violence. And so that is one key thing, that the partnerships that we establish, funding partnerships, but collaboration with different actors in communities, in local governments and in the ministries, with faith-based organizations, to ensure that this work continues. So that concerted effort is what we're really looking at championing going forward. Yes, funding is part of it, but it's not the only part of that. As I said, we also require that at policy making level, that government of Uganda is able to put in place policies that actually enable different actors to prevent and stop violence against women and girls. And some of those include actually laws and policies that help people to report safely, that ensures that government agencies such as the Justice, Law and Order institutions are able to pick up cases that are criminal in nature, prosecute them, and punish the perpetrators of violence, as well as those organizations that are able to provide counseling and safe spaces and listen and help rebuild economic livelihoods of survivors of gender-based violence, that they're in place and they are supported. For example, government has fundings in place for different groups, including women. To what extent is this actually accessible to survivors? And that is something that at policy making level we want to see done, and want to ensure that government is resourcing its key ministry that addresses issues such as this. That's the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. So those are some of the challenges that we have emerged in. But finally, I want to say that one of the key things, and this is an appeal that I really want to make to Ugandans out there, is that this COVID-19 period has exposed our social structure. It shows that the homes that we rent to, that we thought were able to shield us from violence, is not actually shielding us.
The heroes turned out to be the villains.
When we were locked up, we started seeing a surge in the cases. And therefore, I think that it is important for every facet of, whether it is religious, social, cultural, family level, we need to evaluate what values do we stand for. Are we allowing, are we permitting violence against women and girls to happen in the communities? So this is something that has been exposed through this process.
All right. Ms. Mugisha, could it be the fact that we are seeing so many cases of domestic violence, could it be that it's because government focused solely on putting in place measures that can cap the contraction and spread of COVID-19, in that most of the focus was on COVID-19 and not alleviating the effects, which is domestic violence and so forth? Because we noticed in 2019, Mrs. Xavier and Ms. Mugisha, we noticed that 360 people, yes, 360 people died as a result of domestic violence. Now, this year, between January and May, that number was around 161 people who died as a result of domestic violence, and the projections put that number at 480 people who are projected to die from domestic violence. What can be done in the interim to avert such callous projections?
Yeah, what I would like to say is that when COVID-19 came in, I think it just sort of disorganized all of us and the way we work, and emphasis was not put on GBV. We didn't even anticipate what would happen. And the fact that GBV was not seen as a very important issue at that time, you know, for the first few weeks. When it escalated, then it was realized that GBV needs a focus. And even in WHO, WHO also emphasized, the director emphasized that GBV should be prioritized. And by the time that came in, we had already started seeing the surge. But afterwards, when it was realized that GBV was a big issue, the district task forces took it into account, and most of our shelter managers and and staff, some of them were put on the district task forces for COVID to make sure that issues of GBV are addressed. So after that, it became, it was a little easier because it was taken as one of the priorities in most of the districts. So, but I would like to emphasize what Xavier has said, that protection from gender-based violence is the responsibility of the state to its citizens. This country, Uganda, we need to, the state needs to protect its citizens. And therefore, we should allocate resources on these social issues. You know, when people are not protected, they cannot develop. When people are not happy, they cannot develop. So we need to invest more in social protection measures for women especially and girls, so that women can thrive. And when they thrive, that's when you can talk about economic development and so on. I would just like to say that as a component of this program, we had an element of women's economic empowerment, where we are providing seed money to some of these the survivors of gender-based violence and other women, you know, forming groups. And we have seen women thrive and free themselves from violence because they have been economically empowered. And I think that is very, very important. We thank the government that there are these livelihood and economic empowerment programs for women and girls and youth. They should be expanded so that more women can access. Because when women are able to make a contribution, a financial and economic contribution, they always do, but at least when they have their own money and they are able to contribute directly, they are, you know, they are more valued. Because we find that, for example, in places where we have been, where Action Aid and Mifumi, the SAGE program, has supported women to start income-generating projects, we see that it has helped the men also to come on board and support their women. And we found it very, you know, really deep. We found the men saying, it is, you know, for the first time, some of us have been told that what we are doing is wrong, that we need to support our women, that we should not use violence, but we should support our women to have a more progressive family. So we find that this is very, very important, and the state should put resources, more resources. And maybe just...
All right, let's leave it at that. We've run out of time. We have a little bit, like 3 minutes, that I would like to accord to Mrs. Xavier as we wrap up. Mrs. Xavier, we recorded some 13,693 domestic violence cases in 2019. That number has been around 4,809 between January and May of 2020. And according to the projections I've been reading, that number might go up to 14,000. 14,427 domestic violence cases. How best can we avert such bad projections, according to Action Aid Uganda?
First of all, thank you, Romeo. First of all, those numbers, those projections are based on people who report. I even want to paint a grimmer picture that a very insignificant proportion of people who experience violence are actually able to recollect themselves and report at different levels. That said, the figures are likely to be worse than what we're seeing from police statistics and even from ourselves, where I say the numbers that we have are from 13 shelters. They don't cover the entire country. So the point I'm making is that there are more people who are going through this violence quietly and unreported.
So in a nutshell, how do we avert this situation
in
like a minute?
How we avert this situation, number one, is for everyone, and I want to speak to people who are listening to me and viewing out there, that as a man, first of all, we need to disown violence. We need to come to that realization that violence impairs not just our families, not just our sisters, our daughters, and our mothers. It actually affects humanity. It removes humanness out of them. And I think that we need to rise up and stop that and put an end to violence. That is where it all starts. And you have a responsibility. You have individual responsibility as a family, as institutions, whether you're working for the state, in different institutions, in the judiciary, in the Ministry of Gender, in the districts, you have a role. As NGOs, we have a role. As faith-based organizations, mosques, churches, and synagogues, we have a responsibility. So let's take this responsibility seriously. Let's start by putting an end to it, and we put that by starting to come public about it and disown violence against women and girls.
All right. Yeah. Very, very, very wonderful argument by Mr. Xavier. Ms. Mugisha, thanks for having made the time to speak to NTV. Thank you both for coming.
Thank you.
The contentious conversation has been centered around gender-based violence. We need to do more to avert more resources to helping young women and girls alleviate some of the challenges that have been posed by gender-based violence as a fact. My name is Romeo Busiku, and unfortunately we've come to the end of the show, but I'm leaving you with this interview that was done by my reporter Stephen Mbide with Dr. Monica Musenero, the Presidential Advisor on Epidemics. A very good morning.